Let's consider some of the issues of taking a historical art and then putting it into a modern competitive setting. Hi folks, Matt Easton here of Schola Gladiatoria. Now, while I come at this primarily from a HEMA or historical European martial arts or historical fencing, if you prefer, perspective, we're also going to look here at shooting, cars, archery and various other things as well. And really this is a universal problem that we have to, a hump that we have to get over when dealing with a historical skill set or historical technology in some cases and putting it into a modern competitive setting. And it creates some real push and pull, some real friction, lots of arguments, and it's a really complicated topic. We have to accept at the outset when we put anything into a modern competitive setting, it becomes a modern sport, and therefore with all of the baggage that that entails. Now, before I go on, I don't want you to think that I'm one of these people who's completely against sportification in martial arts and all of this kind of stuff. The fact is that I accept that sport has always been part of martial arts, and if we go back to the ancient world, the classical Olympics, or if we go back to gladiatorial games, if we come through to the medieval period with fencing competitions, be it sword and buckler, and then later on backswording, also with longsword, the different fencing guilds, and then blah blah blah, it goes on and on. So fencing, and equally with archery or shooting, there has always been a sporting side to it. It's not always been about killing people. Equally, I've always been a big champion of tournaments in the HEMA scene and historical fencing scene to basically test our skill sets and improve our skills and drive the physical progress of people's fencing forwards, because I think that competing with people in a somewhat combative setting, a non-compliant setting, is very, very important to testing your martial arts and advancing them. Not only does it drive forward our personal skills, but it also drives forward our understanding, especially when we're doing something like HEMA, where in many cases we're reconstructing, or at least some of us are trying to reconstruct lost or forgotten, neglected past skills. And so it's very important pressure testing those to see, you know, does my understanding of this technique, does it actually work against someone who's trying to stop me from making it work? That all being said, we have to accept that in traditional martial arts, and this, you could apply this to Asian martial arts or potentially African martial arts, certainly European martial arts, if we have a traditional thing that we are reconstructing, or some of us are trying to reconstruct, putting it into a modern sports setting can lead us to divergence. They can lead us further and further away from the thing that we're originally studying, because the context has changed so much. So before I delve into some of the HEMA examples, and again this can apply to all sorts of different martial arts and physical skills, let's look at some non-HEMA examples where decisions have been made about the technology that's used or the way that the implements are used to try and keep it rooted in a historical basis. So the other thing I do outside of the sword-based HEMA I do is gun-based HEMA. That's right, I shoot historical firearms, mostly 19th century in my case, so mostly percussion lock and early breech loaders. So I shoot a Winchester lever action, I shoot muzzle loading cap and ball revolvers. Now, the revolvers are a really interesting one, because we all know, if I just grab, this is a deactivated one, but if I just grab this Adams here, so we all know that in the modern world there are certain ways of gripping a pistol, okay? Now, if you are in a black powder revolver competition, at least all the ones that I've ever been in, you are not allowed to grip the pistol like that unless it's specifically said in the rules that you are, okay? Standard in black powder pistol is to hold it in one hand and shoot one-handed. The reason being is that there is almost no historical evidence from the age of cap and ball revolvers of anyone holding a pistol two-handed. Now, I won't go into the reasons why that is, because that's a very complex topic by itself, and I have touched on it in previous videos. But the fact is that they had a way of using these revolvers in period, and so when we're using period revolvers in competition, it has been decided, and I agree with that decision, that that's the way that we should use them, because otherwise, what are we doing? We're just using an old-fashioned revolver in a modern way. And, why not just use a modern revolver? Now, the next example is longbow, or in many cases just barebow, traditional archery. In most competitions that I've ever witnessed or been involved with, you cannot use sights on your longbow. So if you've got a 140-pound English warbow and you're using it for some type of competition, then if you stuck a sight on it, would that make you more accurate? Quite possibly yes. Sights do work. They were invented, and there's a good reason that modern Olympic archery uses them. However, they didn't use them in period, or at least we've got no evidence that they used any kind of sight. Yes, they could have. I have witnessed people that put a like a rubber band around their bow, and they move it up and down. They use that as their sight for different distances. Sometimes they put little lines on the side of the bow. Technically, could people in period have done that? Yes. Is there any evidence that they did that? No evidence that I've ever seen. They learned to shoot instinctively at different ranges because, of course, in most situations, whether it's hunting or warfare, you don't know exactly what distance something's at. It's just like throwing a ball. A modern cricket player or baseball player, you look at where the person you're throwing the ball is, and that's where you throw the ball to, and that's how they learnt to shoot. And so there's no evidence that they use sighting mechanisms in a period. However, if you were in a modern longbow competition and you were allowed to use a sight, and you did use a sight, would it make it more likely that you would score a higher score and win the competition? Yes. So should you do it? I would argue no, because you're using a traditional bow. You're doing traditional archery. So we don't use a sighting device because there's no evidence that they used a sighting device. If you want to use a sighting device, use a modern bow. With archery, there's a whole other elephant in the room, and that is draw weight. If we look at modern Olympic bows, people tend to draw, at least men tend to draw about 40 pounds draw weight bows, I believe, in the Olympics, with recurve bows anyway. And, traditionally 40 pounds is laughably weak. It's not really powerful enough it's powerful enough for some close hunting applications, but most of the evidence we have suggests that most bows, even hunting bows, were at least about 60, 70 pounds draw weight, and war bows were very often well over 100 pounds draw weight. So, and that goes for anywhere, not just English longbows. That could be recurve bows from the Middle East or India or wherever. So the question is draw weight. Now, if we're testing accuracy, so if we have an archery competition at 30, 40, 50 yards, and we use a lighter bow, are most people going to be more accurate? Yes. Again, there's a reason that Olympic archers used 40-pound draw weight bows instead of 80-pound draw weight bows, because quite simply, most people can become more accurate, more proficient. They can hold the bow at full draw for longer at a lower draw weight. So absolutely it makes sense in a modern sporting context, but it doesn't necessarily make sense in a historical context. So therefore, if you're running a traditional archery competition, should there be draw weight restrictions or specifications? And I would argue quite possibly yes, because is it fair for someone who's pulling 80, 90, 100 pounds draw weight to be compared in terms of accuracy at 30 yards with someone who's pulling 30 or 40 pounds draw weight? No, I wouldn't say that is really fair. So therefore, there's this push and pull between trying to be historical and trying to win the competition, and this is always a problem. To very briefly use another comparison completely outside of the world of weapons, let's look at classic cars. Say you're at Goodwood and you're involved in a classic car race, and these are cars that date between, say, 1960 and 1966, okay? Is it fair if you have a classic car from that era and you're essentially racing cars from that era with technology from that era to add modern 2022 brakes onto your classic whatever E-Type Jaguar or something? No, I would say no. Would it be fair to put a modern engine in it? No. Modern power assisted steering? No. So quite simply, if you're racing cars from that era with that technology, would you add modern technology onto that car? No, and usually it wouldn't be allowed. So how does this relate to traditional martial arts? Well, quite simply, I believe that if you are holding a competition of a certain style or period or weapon, or all of those things combined, then those are the parameters for what should be used in that competition. Otherwise, you're purely doing essentially a modern sport fencing competition with unusual weapons. Okay, you may as well be doing Olympic fencing at that point. So one of my favorite examples is in Rapier. Okay, so often, because there's not a colossal number of people doing Rapier in the world, if we go to an event and there is a Rapier tournament, usually there are some very loose specifications for the Rapiers themselves, but it covers a very broad period. You've got to bear in mind that Rapiers were used from about the middle of the 1500s all the way through until the middle of the 1700s, about 200 years. You're thinking, when were they still being used in the 18th century? In Spain, fundamentally, and also Latin America. So if you're in a Rapier competition, is it someone to use a Rapier from circa 1550 with a relatively open swept hilt and a cut and thrust relatively hefty blade against someone who's using a, shall we say, a circa 1750 Spanish Rapier with a cup hilt and essentially an épée blade? Now these are I won't say completely different weapons, these are very different weapons. In a modern sporting competition where there's no real cutting, there's no real thrusting, and we have sporting rules, does the person with a cup hilt have an advantage? Yes, there's a very good reason that lots of competition rapierists use cup hilts. Okay, does someone with a very light and very long blade have an advantage? Yes. These are quite fundamental, simple and demonstrable things. Okay, so there are some people in the world doing Rapier with literally épée blades. Okay, now épée blades are not a good analogue for most types of Rapier. They are really a small sword blade. Okay, they're a long small sword blade. So typical small swords are usually about 32 inches long. Épée blades, if I remember correctly, are about 35 inches long. So they're like a long small sword. So they're super light. They could never really be made to cut effectively because they're triangular. You know, you could scratch someone with one, but you're not going to chop anything with it. So, is it fair to compare a 1300 gram Rapier with a blade that could literally chop into someone's arm with an épée blade, which would never be able to do that? And yet, when you hit someone on the arm or the head in competition, they're both getting equal points. Seems somewhat unfair to me. So I think there's a good example, you might disagree, of where there's a problem, there's a disconnect, because when people are fencing in modern competition, they want to win the competition, they want to get that medal, they want to bring it home for their team or their club or themselves or whatever, they want to move up HEMA ratings, so they use the longest, lightest Rapier blade they can get, and they use the biggest cup hilt they can get, which might not connect to the style of Rapier fencing that they're supposed to be simulating or doing or studying at all. If we take that Rapier example a bit forward in time to small swords, say for example we have a small sword competition, would it be advantageous to use a modern Olympic épée? Imagine you've got now a longer blade, potentially a lighter blade if you're using certain types of small sword blade. Most importantly, perhaps you have a massive guard, you have a big épée bowl guard, which now protects your whole hand and a good part of your forearm if you hold it right. And maybe you use an modern orthopedic pistol grip as well. There's a problem. So usually these wouldn't be allowed in a small sword tournament. But just say, for example, there was a small sword competition where they hadn't specified those things. They hadn't specified the size of the guard, they hadn't specified the style of the grip, or the length of the blade, or whatever, the weight of the blade, where the point of balance is, things like that. You use a modern Olympic épée. Would that be advantageous to you? I would argue yes. A modern Olympic épée has an advantage. It's an épée de combat. It's a developed form of the small sword, but it has an advantage over a typical 18th century small sword with a small hilt of the type that you usually wore in the middle of the or early part of the 18th century. So there's again a disconnect between if we choose something that's optimal for competition versus something that actually is of the period. And this is not just about the tool, this is also about the method. Now this gets even more complicated and even deeper because, of course, if we're using modern Olympic methods because the rules tend to favour those, then we're getting even further away from what we're originally trying to do. If we're originally trying to do a historical martial art with a historical weapon, and we're now using something that's closer to a modern Olympic weapon and something that's closer to modern Olympic fencing, because the rules or the conditions, the context of the competition is closer to modern Olympic style fencing than it is to anything historical, then where does that leave us? That leaves us reinventing modern Olympic fencing. This is a problem with sabres, and in fact there was somewhat of a dialogue on this topic in period. Absolutely, in the late 19th century, there are certain sources that tell you to use the lightest practice sabre you can get. Now you have to bear in mind that the lightest sabre that they could get was still heavier than a modern Olympic sabre. So a modern Olympic sabre is about 400 grams. Most of the sabres that we use in my club are about 800 grams. They're twice as heavy, but more importantly, all of that mass is in the blade. The hilts actually weigh about the same. So they handle very, very differently. In period, there were plenty of people using 600-700 gram sabres. Now, those are interesting because they fill a middle ground. Yes, they're lighter and more nimble than one of our military gymnasium type sabres, but they're still considerably heavier and don't move in the same way because they've got more mass in the blade. That 600 or 700 grams, a lot of that is in the blade again, not the hilt. So they still move considerably different to a modern Olympic sabre. Now, what's the difference? So there are lots of similarities. Modern Olympic sabre on a fundamental level is quite similar to military sabre. However, there are, because the weapon is a lot lighter, and the way that hits are scored, you don't necessarily move it in the same way. You don't cut with it in the same way. You do more of a flick with it, and you don't worry about whether that would have cut or not. You're just making contact with the target. So you end up in a very different place. And this is kind of one of the main points that I want to underline here, is that the different tool and the different rules lead us to different fencing and lead us to different conclusions and lead us to something which looks different to what we would have seen in period. So I'm not going to offer a great conclusion here because it's a real quandary. It's a difficult one and I don't have any great answers to it. But for historical martial arts, and this could apply to traditional Japanese arts or Chinese arts, Filipino, European, whatever, it is a problem. When we take a traditional art using traditional implements of their time and we put it into a modern sporting setting, we can end up with changes to the equipment, changes to the methodology. Because of the way that it's scored, we can see changes in the way that people cut or behaviours, things that they do. And this leads us to a divergence. Now, is that a problem? Well, the first thing I want to say is I think, certainly the traditional arts I practice in HEMA are a pretty broad church and we're fairly tolerant and we try to bring all different motivations in. So in my club, I've got some people who just want to compete and score medals in essentially modern competition. I've got some people who just want to recreate historical skills. And then there's everything in between. And, funnily enough, I would say at various points in my life, I've always been in between those two extremes, but sometimes I've been more towards one and sometimes more towards the other. But pretty much I think I'm kind of in the middle. But I do think that if we are doing a traditional art, a historical art, rather than modern Olympic fencing or modern MMA or whatever, then we must think about the things which are pulling us away from the roots. Okay, if we have competitions which are making us more and more and more like modern Olympic fencing, that might be great in some ways, might be great in training methods, it might be great in terms of fitness and athleticism and things like that. Absolutely, don't deny any of that. Modern Olympic fencing has a whole load of things going for it, but it does move us further and further away from the root of, at least in HEMA, what most of us are trying to get to, which is, how did they use swept hilt rapiers in the 16th century? How did they fence with long swords in the 15th century? How did people who were preparing for war, training with sabres in the Napoleonic period, fence and train? And it's not necessarily the same as a modern competitive setting. If I'm trying to fence by the book, I might fence slightly differently than if I'm just trying to fence to win. And I know people in my club who do well in competitions that kind of admit this. I think they don't always realise they're admitting it, but they admit there are things that they do in competition that are cheap shots essentially, because they score points in competition, but they're not necessarily something you would necessarily do in a life or death duel because they might be risky, or they're not necessarily things that are from the treaties or that would have been done in period. And so we've got this this combination of difference of methodology, difference of competition context, and difference of sometimes training tool or fencing tool, pulling us away from the origin of the art. So it's just something to think about. It's not a huge criticism. If you want to do modern sports sword, that's fine. It's literally no skin off my nose. I don't care. If you want to basically just do reenactment and just recreate, you know, the plates in Talhofer, again, I don't care. That's absolutely fine. I think any of those two extremes are fine. But I think honesty is important. I think it's important within a club to understand what different people want and what they're doing, what they're training, and what the results are, and be honest about what the end result is. If the end result is really modern épée using a rapier, then admit that, and that's fine. If the end result really is just going through some positions and moves and recreating what we see in pictures and not really developing the fencing kind of athleticism and the competing and antagonistic, I suppose, mindset, then that's fine as well. So we are a broad church, but you might find this applies to your traditional arts if it's outside of HEMA. As I say, this is very applicable to Japanese and Chinese martial arts and Filipino. And I would say it's very applicable to unarmed arts as well, particularly MMA. And we have to, you know, there's a lot of criticism of traditional arts in MMA circles because it doesn't work in the octagon. But remember that equally is a specific end goal. Okay, so competing against one other individual in an octagon with the floor you've got, with the walls that you've got, with the rules that you've got, is a specific end goal, and that's a specific sporting end goal. Is it gonna, as a byproduct, make you more effective at protecting yourself in an average bar fight? Yes, but that's true of many martial arts. Anyway, the MMA question is a whole bigger one, but you can see that these are interrelated topics. I hope this has been thought-provoking for some of you, and remember, be tolerant of people with other goals. Not everyone's going to have the same goal as you. Some people just want to do modern sports sword with something that looks cooler than an épée, you know, like with a long sword. That's fine. But when you're building your competitions, when you're building your events, think about what's your end goal. Where do you want to lead people? Do you want to end up with modern sports sword? Do you want to end up with a recreation, a reenactment of old fencing? Do you want something else? Do you just want people to have fun? So anyway, there we go. I hope it's been thought-provoking and useful. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again soon for some more thoughts on the channel. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.